So, thanks a lot, David. Ownershift is a paper by Jörg, Müller, and myself. And in Ownershift, I keep doing that. Ownershift, it's very similar. So bear with me, please. Ownershift facilitates overhead interaction in virtual reality by moving the virtual hand up towards an overhead target while still preserving the sense of body ownership. Now, I would like to start by just considering overhead manipulation tasks. Imagine reaching up to screw in a light bulb in some ceiling lamp. And imagine how strainful that actually is in your shoulders and upper arms. And if this task takes a little bit longer, then it might actually turn into physical pain. And the idea behind Ownershift is that overhead manipulations are rendered less strainful. In virtual reality, however, by slowly guiding the user into a more comfortable posture. I will show you a video of this user interacting, and you will see her reaching up to this panel overhead where she's following a target with her finger. And so just watch her interact and pay attention to where her hand is going. This is fast forward. And you'll notice that while she's still following the target, her hand is actually traveling further and further down until it rests more or less at waist level. So we'll just watch it again real quick. And just watch how her hand is slowly going down. And again, this is fast forward. So she's actually really taking her time following this dot. And it's much more comfortable to follow that target at the bottom. So basically, the principle is that since in VR, we can simply warp the virtual space, we can move the virtual hands to some completely different place than the real hand is. And this brings the virtual hands closer to the overhead target. Now, of course, this will cause a big discrepancy in position between the real and the virtual hand. And the question is, if the virtual hand that you're seeing, because what you're seeing is some virtual hand up here, is so far away from the hand, from your own physical hand that you have somewhere at waist level, will this actually still feel like it's your own hand that you're interacting with overhead? Or does this completely disrupt that feeling of one coherent body? And this refers to the term of body ownership. Some of you might be familiar with this already. I'll just explain it for those who haven't heard of this before. So body ownership is the sense that your own body is your own body. If you consider your own left hand, you know it's your own hand. It's not someone else's. It's not part of the environment. You know that you can grab things with it. You can experience the world with it by touching things. And we feel this sense for our entire physical body normally. But we can also experience body ownership for body external objects. So an example is the rubber hand illusion. In this experiment, a rubber hand is placed next to the user's real hand or participant's real hand. The real hand is hidden from view. And then an experimenter starts stroking both hands with the brush in exactly the same fashion. And this makes the user feel as if he can sense things with the rubber hand. And now watch what happens if this rubber hand is threatened. And the physiological reaction of this participant is very similar to as if his real hand had been threatened. So what happened was that through the multisensory integration, the participant actually starts feeling as if the rubber hand is part of the own body. It becomes integrated into the own body image. Now, illusions like this can also happen in virtual reality. For example, the virtual hand illusion. So, for instance, through visual motor correlation, watching or seeing the virtual hand move like your own hand, or through visual tactile correlation, for instance, feeling a virtual ball bouncing on your fingertip through small vibrations that you feel on your finger. That makes you feel as if this virtual hand could be part of your own body. So there are certain requirements for such body ownership illusions to occur. One of them is there need to be congruent multisensory stimuli. So the strokes that you get on the fingers, for instance, need to be synchronous, what you see and what you feel. There needs to be a plausible appearance and morphology. So we cannot own a wooden block as our hand, for instance. It needs to look like a hand. Also, if we have an artificial hand, it needs to be connected, visibly appear connected to our own body. And it needs to be in a plausible orientation and position in respect to our own body. And in regards to this last point, several studies seem to agree that if this artificial hand is more than 30 centimeters away from your own hand, this significantly disrupts the body ownership illusion. However, most of these studies have explored this without visual motor correlation, so people were not able to move their hand and watch the artificial hand move as well. But we have found this to be very powerful in eliciting the body ownership illusion. That's why we thought this deserves some more exploration. So we designed the Ownershift interaction technique with the aim to reduce muscle strain during overhead interaction while maintaining the illusion of body ownership of the virtual hand, as well as achieving an acceptable degree of accuracy or task performance, if you will. So in our technique, interaction actually begins without a shift. So you reach up and you interact at the top. And only if this interaction is prolonged, your own hand is slowly traveling down, almost unnoticed, because the virtual hand's moving up, gently guiding you into a more comfortable position. We modeled this shift of the virtual hand as it's a rotation around the shoulder, so of the hand around the shoulder, and the user will automatically compensate for this upward shift of the virtual hand, moving his hand down along this like green circular path that you can see. And this leads to a vertical offset between the real and the virtual hand that we've named D, and in our case, it's about 65 centimeters distance in average between them. The setup that we used to explore this technique consisted of an HTC Vive and 2 leap motion sensors that we attached in the front of the headset. One of them pointing forward, allowing hand tracking in line of sight, and the second one actually allowing hand tracking in front of the user's torso while looking up. To increase immersion and help elicit the illusion of body ownership, we also taped a small LRA motor onto the participant's fingertip, giving vibrotactile feedback during interaction. So when the participants moved their finger over the panel, they could actually feel slight vibrations as if it gave them a feeling of friction. Of course, warping the virtual space to make targets more accessible is not a very novel idea. For instance, in the go-go interaction technique, nonlinear mapping between the real and the virtual hand allows users to reach for distant targets. A system called Ergo relocates targets into a primary work zone that is closer to the user to reduce strain. Or haptic retargeting techniques in which the virtual space is warped, guiding the user to touch a haptic prop while reaching for some virtual target. But I would like to highlight the main points in which our approach differs from this related work. So first of all, we think that the small offsets used in ergo and haptic retargeting approaches would not actually cause any significant effect for overhead interaction. It would not make this task any easier. And instead of exploring horizontal shifts, we explore large vertical shifts, which are more relevant for overhead manipulations. Also, shifting the hand position while reaching requires slow, controlled movements. So in haptic retargeting, if you reach and your virtual hand deviates from your real hand, you have to do this slowly so that you can compensate during the reach. In our approach, you can actually reach quickly because the offset is only added afterwards. And finally, there has not been an evaluation of body ownership, like how all these points before influence the sense of body ownership during interaction. We evaluated our interaction technique comparing it to 4 other conditions in a user study. We had 16 participants, and the procedure was as follows. So we had a training session in which they got familiar with the system, and they could practice interaction in all the conditions. And then we had 5 trials, 1 trial per condition, in which there were 2 phases. In the first phase, we induced the body ownership illusion. And then in the second phase, they completed a pursuit tracking task, and we tried to find out whether the body ownership illusion that was induced prior would break or not. Finally, they filled in some questionnaires on paper. So the phase 1, elicitation of body ownership, worked through visual motor and visual tactile correlation. First, they could see the virtual hand moving like their own hand, and then they could feel the bounces of a virtual ball on their fingertip through the vibration motor. And in phase 2, they completed this tracking task for 2 minutes. So they just followed this target as closely as they could, which is a pursuit tracking task as proposed by Polton. And they did this in one of 5 conditions, one after the other. The first condition, Ownershift, reflects our proposed interaction technique. So there was a gradual shift of the virtual hand upwards and their own hand down. We compared this to an instant shift, where the virtual hand was instantly shifted to the top, which means that the user had to compensate for this offset right from the start and had to first locate the virtual hand. Just to show you the difference between these two, on the left you see Ownershift. So he reaches up, interacts at the top, and then the hand is moving down only while he actually interacts with this target already. So the first reach was not actually was not shifted, the space was not warped. However, on instant shift, we do have this warp of space right from the start. We compared this to a top condition, which is basically unaided overhead interaction, and a bottom condition, which is a baseline condition, and finally a control condition in which we applied quasi-random shifts to the virtual hand. So the virtual hand just moved around in different directions, and it was very hard to control, and this intended to break the body ownership illusion and deliver performance measurements that were unacceptable. The measurements we made for physical strain were questionnaire items rated on a Borg CR10 scale. For the body ownership illusion, as well as agency and performance measures or self-assessments, we had questionnaire items rated on a 7-point Likert scale. And we measured task performance as the root mean square error. I will just briefly review the main results. More details can be found in the paper. So we found that shifting the virtual hand successfully reduced strain compared to unaided overhead interaction. We also found that the illusion of body ownership persisted despite this large offset between the real and the virtual hand. And we found that task performance with the shift is only slightly lower than without the shift. Furthermore, there was no difference in task performance between the two shift conditions. So this is important because we thought that while you're compensating for the shift, you might actually have lower performance, but this was not the case. Furthermore, we had interviews at the end and gathered some qualitative data as well. We found out that the gradual offset was considered more comfortable and less disruptive than an instant shift. Also, the adjustment to the gradual shift happened automatically, and many participants said that they barely noticed this actually happening. Also, both shift conditions were perceived as much more comfortable than interacting at the top for 2 minutes, as you can imagine. Furthermore, participants said that they felt in control and felt really good about their task performance, and that they could actually adjust quickly to the task. So this leads to the conclusion that the Ownershift interaction technique effectively reduces strain during overhead interaction, and also that a gradual shift, as an Ownershift, is actually preferable to an instant shift, since it first of all allows a swift reaching to the target in the beginning, and it's also less disorienting, less conspicuous, and there's no difference in task performance to the instant shift. Furthermore, we found that the virtual hand illusion is more robust to such large vertical offsets than was previously assumed. So this means that instead of modifying the virtual world with which we interact, we can actually consider to modify the virtual body that we interact through without losing that feeling that this is actually our own body. With this, I conclude my presentation, and I would just like to add one more comment, which is that I'll be defending my thesis next week, so I might be looking for new opportunities in research. Thank you.
A lot of great people to hire in this session. That's awesome. So please step up to the microphone.
Hi, Sean Vollmer, Stanford University. Great talk. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the rate at which you're doing this remapping and how fast do you think you can go and how that affects things?
That is an excellent question. Actually, so the point of how fast we can go is something that we would need to explore further. So the rate, the speed that we had, right now we go within 45 seconds from the top to the bottom, and we figured this out really just in pilot studies, trying to figure out, when do they get disoriented. But this really requires more exploration. And as to how we did this, so we tried different variations. The first thing we did was basically really just moving the hand up or down. But that leads to the hand moving further away as you go down, and also as you go up, because you move on this arc, right, around your shoulder. So we really had to make sure that the virtual hand traveled up along this arc so that your own hand travels down along the same arc, and you can kind of keep more or less the same angle of your elbow while you do this. And that makes it less noticeable. Of course, if you're doing a task that requires some amount of arm motion anyways, it really becomes much less noticeable. It will probably depend strongly on the task that you're performing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
okay.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, Adrian from Fraunhofer. My question is, if you are, well, the hand is at the start at the top, and then you move the hand slowly down. Mm-hmm. But if the user is finished with his interaction, the virtual hand is up there and the real hand is down there.
Yes.
What are your ideas on, finishing up your transformations?
Another excellent question. Thanks for asking that. This is, again, another point that we would need to explore in future. I do have some ideas of how to do that. Also, so imagine you have two different targets that you might want to attend to, and now it's shifted to optimize for interaction with this one, but not with this one. How would you do that? And at the moment, the solution is as soon as your hand leaves the field of view, the shift snaps back. Of course, if you're used to this shift already by then, this might be disorienting. So there are multiple things that we could consider, like making it go slowly. Again, we would have to explore how fast this happens. Another idea that I think I would prefer is have the user actually say, all right, now I want to focus on this one. I'm not quite sure yet what the best approach would really be, but it's certainly a challenge that we haven't really accounted for yet.
Yeah, I guess you could also look at redirected walking, where when the user turns, the turn is actually bigger or smaller than the real turn. So maybe if he looks down, you could do some trickery and move the hand up.
Absolutely,
like that.
yeah. I think it's still not quite explored when you recalibrate your body image. So maybe actually by just moving your hand out of view, you might automatically recalibrate to your normal hand position. So I really don't know. We really have to explore that further. But I think using head motions to kind of trick you into not noticing some offsets would be a good approach or a good start.
Maybe we can brainstorm later.
Yeah, that's an idea.
Maybe a short last question.
Okay, cool. No, actually, much of it was already discussed, because I was going to also ask you about transitions and all that. Something that I would add is maybe according to where your hand is in your field of view, you could also compensate faster or slower. Mm-hmm. But my question, the one that I was remaining is, why don't you also compensate for the neck rotation? Because you interact down here, but you're still like that.
Yeah, that's true. So the thing here is that sometimes, at least in the physical world, there are things that are overhead. And at the moment, the approach is that you move virtual objects into a more comfortable position, right? So that would compensate for neck rotation. But what if you can't actually move the target? And I think the greater picture here is if this was augmented reality, and you had a real-world object there, but you could interact with your virtual arm, then you would probably look at the real-world object. So that was really the prior assumption, that we cannot move the target.
All right, there seems to be a longer discussion going on.
We can discuss this afterwards, yeah, I'd be happy to.
All right, let's give Tiare